Hi, these are three short videos introducing an ethical response to the climate crisis for someone from the UK. I believe that almost everyone in the UK would want to do the right thing if it could be clearly shown to them. I believe that anyone watching this video almost certainly wants to do the right thing. So unfortunately, in the 21st century, this is very hard to do. Even buying a coffee can be problematic, simply not having enough information on the supply chains, the reliability of the certification of the supply chains, the conditions of the workers involved, the animals, well, the cows involved in producing the milk, or perhaps the almond milk. Is this actually better for the planet than cow's milk? What about water consumption? Consideration of global ethics is difficult. So this first video will go a very short way to begin to consider where we stand in the UK in relation to the world and the crises of climate, biodiversity and pollution. We'll consider the idea of fair shares. The next video goes a little further to begin to look at the past of the UK and the country's impact on the planet. And the final video takes the conclusions of the first two and offers some suggestions for action that are surprisingly simple but could make a difference. In all the videos, I talk about climate breakdown, but at each point, focus could equally be on the biodiversity crisis or the pollution crisis. It's just for brevity, I've picked one crisis as representing them all in a way. So high in the Andes in Peru, there's a natural glacial lake that is a lake that's been dammed by moraine, which is material that's been left behind as a glacier moves. So moraine is loose and granular, and a moraine dammed lake can be dangerous because the dam can destabilize and burst, causing catastrophic floods and debris flows. Thanks to global warming, the glaciers are melting faster than ever. As the meltwater fills the glacial lake, the risk of dam burst grows. So the small town of Juarez have built flood protection measures to protect themselves from this potential hazard. RWE is a German multinational energy company. It generates electricity and trades it around the world. America, Europe, Asia Pacific. It's enormous, and it's powered German industry throughout the 20th century using many coal-fired power stations. So thanks to climate attribution science, the causal link between RWE's emissions and the melting of the glaciers can be established. And Saul, who lives in Juarez, is quite reasonably asking for a small proportion of the costs of the flood protection measures that Juarez are building. And they're asking for that cost from RWE. As RWE have contributed 0.47% of the greenhouse gas emissions, then it's reasonable that they ask for 0.47% of the total costs of the flood protection works. So it's pretty clear that our actions in Europe have impacts around the world which are causally linked. So in the past, nobody really considered the effects of our actions in the UK and what they would have on people on the other side of the world. But we've moved beyond that now, and it's now clear that what happens in the UK can affect others around the world. So what should we be doing? How should we take this into account in our actions? Well, at least in the distant future, we now have the Climate Change Act 2008, which is a UK law that commits the government to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. So there's a feeling that at least at that point, that rather distant point, all will be perfectly clear, as we'll no longer be causing climate change. We should just sit tight and obey any laws and regulations given to us by the government. But that's less clear to me. At the moment, it feels as though there's certainty in the past, that's happened, and there's certainty in the future, but what should we do in the present? Here's a recent report by the UK's Climate Change Committee dated July 24. In the UK, we've made some progress towards net zero. Interestingly, we're not doing enough for adaptation in our own country. However, we've set national targets to reach net zero by 2050, and we're not on track to hit our interim targets in 2030. It's worth noting firstly that the emissions reductions targets exclude our consumption emissions, which are currently higher than our production-based emissions. That is, emissions that that are associated with the goods that we buy and use in the UK. So that's the first thing that's worth noting. Secondly, often when making change, we change the easy things that first, the things that we can easily change first, and then we get around to the harder stuff later. And it's certainly going to be the case for sectors such as aviation and international shipping, cement and steel production, that these are going to be very difficult things to get down to net zero on. So we've got some difficult times ahead, and we're not even on track, having dealt with some of the easier things. So let's think about three aspects of climate change, the climate breakdown initially. One, that we're up against the clock because the more emissions we put up there, the worse things are. Let's think about fair shares, each country emitting carbon, and let's think about the global north and the global south. So here's a graph from the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. And we know that global greenhouse gas emissions accumulate and cause global warming. We know that we can only emit so much more in order to have a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, or the far inferior target of 2 degrees. And this graph shows the woeful state that we're in as a planet, trying to limit our global emissions, which currently can be seen to be somewhere between 50 and 60 gigatons per year, and according to the implemented policies, are not expected to drop much. However, if we're going to limit our emissions such as to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, you can see the blue line there heading down quite steeply and tailing off very sharply. So these two figures are from the Mercator Research Institute, and they've estimated the total amount of carbon that can be emitted into the atmosphere, total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere before we affect our chances of staying below 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So of all the carbon that we've already emitted, we now just have 211 gigatons left in our budget before we exceed this key value of 1.5 degrees. And then for 2 degrees, we've still got another 960 gigatons left in the budget. These figures were current on the 25th of July 24. I expect they're much lower already, as you noticed in the last slide, that we're emitting carbon at a rate of about 50 gigatons per year. That's 1 gigaton per week, roughly. So currently it's looking like both of these targets are rather unlikely to be met. This is from the same report, and you don't have to be the cleverest climate scientist on the planet to come up with the conclusions that these people have come up with, and that is that we need rapid, deep, and in most cases immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. So actually slight reductions in carbon emissions, or just being a bit more sustainable, they're not going to stop these higher temperatures and the immense suffering associated with them. So here's our plan in the UK. It's a graph by the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, based on the Climate Change Committee's net zero pathway to hit the 1.5 degree temperature rise ambitions. And this broadly shows that we're going to gradually reduce our emissions over the next 26 years, roughly in a straight line. Yeah, there's a slight curve, but it's roughly a straight line from here to 2050, 26 years away. Now, as our current emissions, based on production, consumption, international shipping, and aviation, or shares of those values, they're around about 1 gigaton a year, let's say. We don't have to worry about too much about the details here. This is around 1 gigaton a year. That means that over the next 26 years, if we do reduce our emissions in a linear way, which I'll be surprised, but we could do, if we can reduce our emissions in a linear way, we'll emit a further 13 gigatons. It's the area of the triangle. 26 is the base, the height is 1, half base times the height, 13 gigatons. Right. So this is actually quite a lot of carbon. This is more than the total cumulative emissions of the low-income countries of the world between 1750 and 2022. So since the middle of the 18th century and now, the low-income countries in the world, who have a combined population of over 600 million, they've emitted just over 10 gigatons of greenhouse gases. We're planning to emit a further 13 gigatons of greenhouse gases. So let's think a little bit more about fair shares and emissions. So let's start off with this statement from the UN. I don't believe that I'm more important than anyone else, and I doubt that many people that I meet believe this either. For the sake of the arguments that I'm making, I'm just taking it at face value that all humans are equal. So for Earth's temperatures to remain less than 1.5 degrees, there's finite amounts of greenhouse gas emissions the atmosphere can take, somewhere around about 2,000 gigatons in total. Based on this, we can review what proportion of this budget each country would have as a fair share, and what proportion of this each country has actually emitted. So if the world were a village of 120 people, 8 billion people or so, our population, just under 70 million, is about 1/20th of that. So the UK would be one person in a village of 120 people. But that person has now emitted the equivalence of the carbon dioxide allowance of 5 people. However, Africa in the same village would be represented by 22 people, and their emissions would be limited to that of the allowance of just 3 people. So it's seen that in the UK we've emitted more than our fair share. Here's the same fair shares analysis presented graphically. The figure on the left is the cumulative emissions, the figure on the right, the figure on the left is the fair share of cumulative emissions, the figure on the right is the actual share. As these figures contain continents and countries and geographical groupings, but they all add up to the entire world and its emissions. On the left-hand side, it's interesting to compare the UK, Africa, China, and the US with the right-hand side. You can see that the UK is very small on the left, and yet on the right, we've actually emitted 5 times more than our fair share. We can see that Africa is very large on the left. It has a large share allotted to it, but it's only emitted a very small amount. Sometimes I hear people blame overpopulation for climate change. I know also, and also India and China based on recent emissions. But this graphic, it shows otherwise. It shows that China have actually emitted less than their fair share. India have emitted far less than their fair share. The big culprits are really the USA, the UK, and Europe. So can we see which countries are going to be affected most by global warming? Well, one simple thing might be to look at estimated death rates from non-optimal temperatures, and this Our World in Data map shows this. Broadly, the obvious effect of global warming on people tends to focus on these countries close to the equator. therefore it's going to strongly affect Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asia. But higher temperatures is not the only effect of climate breakdown. How can we understand which countries will be affected by climate breakdown the most? Well, Notre Dame University has an index scale which considers vulnerability to climate breakdown and readiness to cope with climate breakdown. So how vulnerable a country is to climate change depends on its exposure to the worsening climate or weather. For instance, it might be sensitivity to changes such as sea level rise. So for Bangladesh, 75% of its country is less than 10 meters above sea level. And then as well as exposure, we can see that vulnerability relates to a country's ability to adapt to negate the effects of climate breakdown. Is there something simple that that country could put in place which would negate the effects of the climate change? So that's vulnerability. And then readiness, it broadly depends on the country's access to money and the strengths of its institutions and society. So countries like the UK are not especially vulnerable to climate change, and we're relatively wealthy, stable, we have strong institutions, and thus we have a high readiness and a low vulnerability. So we would do well in the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative. Here's a map that illustrates the scores of countries around the world. So red indicates those countries lowest on the index, and this correlates pretty well with the temperature rises, but it can be seen that almost the whole of Africa, Central Southeast Asia and South Asia, along with most of South America, are low on the index scale. This group can broadly be termed the Global South. The darker green countries who have much better scores can broadly be termed the Global North. And here are the bottom 10 countries on the scale, 7 of which are in Africa. I remember how Africa as a continent has contributed almost nothing to the climate crisis. So if the whole world had a similar carbon footprint to Africa, we would not even be 1/10 along the road to exceeding the carbon budget for the 1.5 degrees target. So let's recap a little bit. We know that our local actions in the UK have dire global effects. We know that we've already exceeded our fair share of carbon emissions. We are high in readiness, low in vulnerability, especially compared to other countries. And globally, we're not planning to keep globally, we're unlikely to keep temperatures to less than 1.5 or even 2 degrees of warming without rapid, deep cuts. And the UK government is no different in this respect. So we've contributed enormously to the climate crisis. And then in the next video, we'll go a little further to begin to look at the UK's impact on the planet in terms of not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also economics.